What's going on, guys? So this is going to be a little tutorial on how to replace the capacitors in a Game Gear. This will fix a lot of common problems with the Game Gear, such as no sound, no picture, intermittent power, all those things. I'm going to make this guide as comprehensive as possible, but I only have one Game Gear. There's a few different revisions, but the process is exactly the same on all of them. You just use different size capacitors in different locations. Alright, so the first thing we need here is a soldering iron. Try not to get anything larger than 40 watts as we don't want to burn off any traces. Next we'll need some solder. Next you're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver. Also, depending on which revision you have, you may also need a number 8 game bit screwdriver. And lastly, we'll just need our capacitors. The easiest way to do this is just to buy a complete kit that has capacitors for every single motherboard revision. Alright, so the first thing we need to do here is flip the console over and then remove the two battery covers off the back of the console. Next we're going to need to remove the 7 screws off the back of the console. These can either be Phillips head or game bit. Once you remove the screws, lift the case up gently from the bottom, being mindful of the 2 cables running to both boards on the top of the console. Now simply just disconnect all 3 cables from the 2 daughter boards and then pull away the top of the case. Alright, so the first PCB we're going to be working on is the audio amp board. So first thing we need to do is remove the 4 screws from the shielding and simply lift it out, and then remove the 2 screws holding it on the audio board. Alright, once you have the board out, take note of which capacitors go where. On mine, you can see I have 3 100 microfarad and 2 47 microfarad capacitors. We need to replace these capacitors with the same values that were already on the board. If you can't get the same voltage, just go a voltage step 1 higher than what's written on them. Alright, the easiest way to remove these capacitors is just to heat one leg at a time with your soldering iron and then gently lift it up. Try not to apply too much heat to the leg or pull the capacitor out too early, as you might rip a pad. Once you have the capacitor removed, using your soldering iron and some solder, clean up the pads on the PCB. Now all we have to do is remove the rest of the capacitors off this PCB and replace them with the same values from our kit. Some kits are fitted with non-surface mount components, such as ones with legs, so to make them fit you just have to trim the legs and bend them to fit. Once you've done replacing all the capacitors, your audio board should look something like this. Depending on which capacitors you bought, you may have to use a different orientation, but this won't affect the performance of the board. Now that the audio board is done, all we have to do is just simply put it back into the housing and then screw it down. Depending on how you put your capacitors in, you may have to bend them slightly to get them to fit, but this won't hurt them. Alright, now we're going to move on to the power PCB. Again, it's just held down with 2 small Phillips head screws. Before we try and remove the PCB, you have to peel off this black piece of plastic covering over the battery compartment. Then to remove the PCB, just simply pull it straight out of the case. One very common cause of intermittent power is actually a cracked solder joint on the end of the barrel plug. To remedy this, all we need to do is reflow all 3 legs on the end of the barrel jack terminal. As with the audio board from before, take note of the values and locations of all the electrolytic capacitors on the PCB. Removing through-hole capacitors is similar to removing the surface mount ones from before. All we have to do is simply heat up one leg at a time and pull it out. Installing the new capacitor is pretty straightforward. All we have to do is take the new capacitor, make sure it's in the right orientation, push the legs through the 2 holes, solder both of the legs, and then trim the excess legs off the PCB. Now we'll go ahead and do this to the other capacitors on the PCB, and when you're done you should have something that looks similar to this. Now that the power PCB has been fixed, we can put it back into the housing. Simply just press it back down as before and then replace the 2 screws, including the plastic cover over the battery compartment. Now it's time to move on to the motherboard. Depending on which revision you have, the capacitor values and layout may be different. Also, depending on your revision, you may also need to remove the motherboard from the housing. Alright guys, so the easiest way to take the capacitors off the motherboard is to use a pair of pliers and gently wiggle the capacitor. We just want to break the glue from underneath it. Once we have the capacitor loosened, we can just bend the capacitor straight up and then either desolder the legs or trim them off. Alright guys, so putting the new capacitors on the motherboard is really simple. All we need to do is trim the legs nice and short and then bend them slightly so they're closer to the motherboard. Then using a pair of tweezers or your fingers, hold it down, and then solder both the legs to the PCB. Now go ahead and do this to all the other electrolytic capacitors on the motherboard and you'll be done. If all went to plan, you should end up with something that looks a bit like this. Again, depending on which capacitors you bought, your orientation may be a bit different, but this won't affect the performance of the device. Alright guys, if all went well, you should now have a fully functioning Game Gear. So if you liked the tutorial, please don't forget to thumbs up and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments or anything, just leave them down in the comments below and I'll try and get back to you. Thanks for watching and I'll see you on my next video. Bye! Hi guys, thanks for watching my video. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, it really helps me out. Also, you can find me on Twitter and on my website. I'll put the links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in my next video.